I remember exactly when it hit me. We were driving home from a family event, both of us tired, and as we sat in traffic, the silence between us grew thicker, heavier. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion, but as the minutes dragged on, I realized this was different. I couldn't think of a single thing to say. Normally, we talk about the weird things our relatives did, or crack jokes about the terrible food, but that night, nothing. We sat there like strangers in the same car, with a silence that felt as deep as an ocean. I found myself staring out the window, wondering how we'd ended up here. When we got home, I went through our usual routines, made tea, sat on the couch with my phone, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. In the dim light of our living room, I watched him on the other side of the couch, absorbed in his own world, and for the first time, I felt the distance between us as something real, tangible, like a wall we'd built without even realizing it. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, a dull ache growing in my chest as I wondered if this was what we'd become. The days that followed only made things worse. I tried to bring us back to how things used to be, suggested we go out for dinner, even booked tickets to a show I knew he'd been wanting to see. But it was like trying to light a match in a rainstorm. Every time I'd reach out, he'd pull further away, until eventually I stopped trying. And that silence? It became our new normal. We'd sit across from each other at meals, barely speaking, both of us scrolling through our phones like teenagers. I told myself it was just a phase, that we'd find our way back. But with every passing day, the silence grew, and I started to feel invisible in my own home. One evening, I walked in to find him asleep on the couch, sprawled out with the TV on low, and for some reason, that moment broke something in me. I stood there, watching him, feeling this strange mix of love, anger, and loss. I wanted to shake him awake, ask him where he'd gone, why he'd left me here to feel like this, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat beside him, feeling that familiar loneliness settle over me. I thought about waking him up to talk, but I was scared of what he'd say, or worse, that he'd have nothing to say at all. After that, I started noticing other things. The way he'd come home later than usual, always with some excuse. The lack of effort he put into even the smallest gestures. The way he'd stop looking me in the eyes when we talked, as if he couldn't bear to see what I was feeling. There were nights I'd lie awake next to him, listening to him breathe, wondering how I'd ended up here, in this hollow version of a relationship I'd barely recognized. I wanted to ask him if he felt it too, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. What if he did feel it and just didn't care? Finally, one night after dinner, I couldn't keep it in anymore. I remember looking across the table, feeling the weight of everything we weren't saying, and I just blurted it out. "Do you even want to be here anymore?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He looked up, startled, and for a moment, I thought he'd brush it off, say I was overthinking. But instead, he looked down, his expression tense, like he'd been waiting for this moment too. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't know if I even feel the same way anymore." His words hit me like a punch. All the denial, all the rationalizing I'd done to convince myself things were fine, it all crumbled in an instant. I felt this strange numbness, like my mind was shutting down to protect me from the reality of what he'd just said. But at the same time, I felt this rush of relief, as if finally we were both seeing things for what they were. "What happened to us?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "When did we stop caring?" He looked at me, and for the first time in months, there was something raw in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think we just stopped trying. Maybe we got comfortable, or maybe we just grew apart. I honestly don't know." We spent hours that night unpacking everything we'd been hiding. We talked about the years we'd spent together, the dreams we'd shared, the way things had slowly changed without either of us noticing. There was no yelling, no blame, just two people finally facing the truth they'd been avoiding. By the time we'd finished, it was clear that we were both too tired to keep pretending. We agreed, almost silently, that it was time to let each other go. The first few days after he moved out were brutal. I'd find myself wandering from room to room, half expecting him to be there, only to remember that he wasn't coming back. The apartment felt hollow, like an empty shell of the life we'd built together. Every little thing seemed to remind me of him. The coffee mug he used, the worn-out book on his side of the bed, the scent of his cologne that still lingered in the air. I'd curl up on the couch, staring at the walls, feeling like I'd lost a part of myself. I wish I could say I found some immediate sense of freedom or peace, but that wouldn't be the truth. In the weeks that followed, I stumbled through my days, trying to adjust to a life without him. I started cooking for one, going to bed earlier, filling my evenings with books and TV shows I'd always wanted to watch but never got around to. But there were moments, usually late at night, when the loneliness crept in and I'd feel this hollow ache, wondering if I'd made the right choice or if I'd just thrown away something I could never get back. I'd sit there, my mind racing, wondering if we'd given up too soon, if maybe we could have saved it if we'd just tried a little harder. But every time I reached that point, I remembered the silence between us, the way he'd stopped looking at me, the nights spent lying next to someone who felt a million miles away. And as painful as it was, I knew deep down that we'd already lost each other long before we said the words. Slowly, I started picking up the pieces of my life. I signed up for a yoga class, reconnected with old friends, even took up painting, something I hadn't done in years. It was strange, rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried beneath the weight of a relationship that no longer fit. I found that I could laugh again, feel something like happiness in the smallest things, like the warmth of the sun on my face, or the quiet satisfaction of finishing a book. Little by little, I started feeling like myself again. Some days, I still catch myself thinking about him, wondering if he feels the same sense of loss, or if he's moved on without a second thought. There's this weird emptiness, like a hole that used to be filled with all the memories and routines we shared. And sometimes, I wonder if that feeling will ever fully go away. So here I am, trying to navigate this new chapter of my life. For anyone who's been through a breakup like this, how did you cope with the emptiness that followed? Did you find something meaningful in the process? Or does it just get easier over time? I could use a little hope right now. The first time I saw Rachel, she was laughing, this full, radiant sound that filled the entire room. We were at a mutual friend's housewarming, and she was leaning back in her chair, recounting some story that had everyone hanging on her every word. I remember thinking I'd never met someone who seemed so alive. She caught me staring and smiled, asking if I'd mind grabbing a drink with her. By the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers and talked about everything from our favorite books to the best road trip routes across the country. She was clever, magnetic, and open-hearted, the kind of person who made everyone feel special. Green flags were everywhere. What stood out the most, though, was her sincerity. I'd been in a string of shallow relationships before her, the kind where every conversation felt like a sparring match or an audition. Rachel wasn't like that. She'd text out of the blue with a genuine thinking of you, or saw this and thought of you. She remembered details, my favorite movie, the way I like my coffee, how I always got anxious before big presentations. After a few months, it seemed clear she was someone who really understood me. My friends loved her too. Even my skeptical older sister, who usually had something to say about everyone I dated, was excited for me. But one night, over dinner with my sister, she asked, "Have you noticed Rachel sometimes needs to be the center of attention?" She said it cautiously, trying not to seem critical, but I shrugged her off. Rachel was social and confident. That's what had attracted me to her in the first place. Besides, she was so supportive, especially when I needed a boost in my life. I figured my sister was just being overprotective. The first hint of trouble came one weekend when Rachel and I took a trip to the coast. We'd been planning it for weeks, but when we got there, she spent most of the first night on her phone, scrolling through her feed, checking in with friends who were out that night. When I asked if she was present, she laughed it off, saying, "I'm just updating a few people." But the next day, we were walking along the beach, and I noticed she seemed distant, more focused on getting the perfect photo than actually being there with me. I told myself it was just a minor thing, that maybe I was just being overly sensitive. Back home, I noticed more moments like that. She'd interrupt a conversation to check her messages or make comments about other people's relationships that made me uncomfortable. She'd say things like, "I just wish more people could be as open as we are." On the one hand, it felt good to hear her value us so highly. But on the other, there was something subtly competitive about it, like she needed us to be better, to look better. When I brought it up, she'd look at me with these wide, wounded eyes and say, "Don't you think our relationship is special?" And I really did. I just wasn't sure I liked what she needed special to mean. Around the 5-month mark, there was a night that still sits with me. We were out at a bar with some of her friends, and at one point, I slipped away to chat with a guy I'd met at a work conference who happened to be there. Rachel joined us after a few minutes, but I could tell by her expression that something was off. When we got home, she asked, "Who was that guy?" I explained, but she kept digging, almost as if she was looking for a reason to be upset. She said things like, "I just don't get why you wouldn't introduce me right away." And, "Are you embarrassed to be seen with me?" She wasn't raising her voice, but her tone had this hard edge to it. For the first time, I felt a pang of discomfort I couldn't ignore. I tried to reassure her, saying that I'd just gotten caught up in conversation, and that of course I wanted her there. She softened, eventually, but the accusation had struck a nerve. I felt like I'd suddenly entered some unspoken territory I didn't understand. From then on, her little insecurities started to surface more often. She'd say things like, "I just want to know you'd choose me over anyone else," or "Sometimes I worry I'm not enough for you." These comments would catch me off guard because, in all honesty, I'd never given her a reason to feel that way. And every time, she'd make me promise that she was my priority, like she needed constant affirmation that she was the center of my world. The turning point came on what was supposed to be a quiet, cozy night. We decided to stay in, watch a movie, and unwind. Halfway through, she got up to get some water and glanced at my phone, which had buzzed with a text from an old friend. She sat back down, but her mood shifted completely. She asked, "Why is she texting you? Does she know you're with me?" I told her it was nothing, that I hadn't even seen the message yet, but she wouldn't let it go. It escalated into an argument where she kept saying, "I just don't feel like you're taking us seriously if you're still talking to other people." That night, I slept on the couch, more frustrated than I'd ever been in a relationship. It was a small moment, but it felt like all those little concerns I'd brushed aside had come together in one big, unignorable wave. She had this need for control, for exclusivity, that went beyond the normal bounds of a relationship. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wanted to isolate me, to keep me tethered to her approval. The next morning, she apologized, saying she was just insecure and needed reassurance. But something had broken for me. I realized that the qualities I'd once seen as passion and openness were masking something darker. She was possessive, maybe even manipulative, and her need to feel like my number one was edging out every other important relationship in my life. I tried talking to her, explaining that I needed room to have my own connections, my own friendships. But she just looked at me with this devastated expression and asked, "Why am I not enough?" It was like any boundary I tried to set was somehow an assault on her, a statement that she was inadequate. I finally told her that I couldn't be the answer to her every insecurity, that a healthy relationship needed trust and independence too. It didn't go over well. She cried, and I almost caved, but I knew that going back would only lead us down the same path again. Ending it was painful and left me questioning myself. Was I too distant, or was I just trying to hold on to a part of myself? Looking back, it's easy to see how the green flags I loved in her, her attentiveness, her loyalty, her intensity, had hidden something I wasn't ready to confront. So now I'm left wondering, Reddit, when do green flags turn into red ones? How do you know when someone's devotion is genuine and when it's just a way of holding on too tight? And how do you learn to trust your instincts, even when it hurt? When I met Ethan, he was everything I thought I'd been waiting for. We were both seated at a friend's birthday dinner, and by the end of the night, I'd felt like I'd known him my whole life. He was funny in this effortless way, had a magnetic smile, and looked at me with such warmth that I felt something spark almost instantly. When he asked me to go for coffee the next day, it felt like it was meant to be. In the beginning, everything was easy. We'd spend whole weekends together, wrapped up in each other, with Ethan constantly telling me how he couldn't believe he'd found me. He paid attention to every detail. He'd remember little things like my favorite flowers or how I liked my coffee, and would surprise me with small gestures that showed he genuinely cared. My friends and family adored him, especially because he was always there for me. I was certain that I'd found my person, that the endless dating disappointments were behind me. But as time passed, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite explain. I remember the first moment I felt that strange flutter of worry. It was one night after we'd spent the day together, and he noticed I got a text from a coworker, a guy named Matt. Ethan asked who he was, his tone casual, but, I don't know, intense. I explained Matt was just a friend from work, and Ethan nodded, then said, "You probably shouldn't text him at night. People might get the wrong idea." He said it with a half smile, but there was something sharp in his eyes that made me hesitate. I didn't want him to feel uncomfortable, so I told Matt I'd text him tomorrow instead. After that, Ethan's comments about my friends grew more frequent, though always disguised as friendly advice or concern. He'd say things like, "I just feel like Kate takes advantage of you. You deserve friends who respect your time." Or, "Why does Sam always call you to vent about his problems? You should know you have your own stuff to handle." At first, I thought he was just looking out for me, helping me see things that maybe I was too close to notice myself. Slowly, though, I started feeling wary about my friendships, thinking, maybe he's right. Maybe they don't have my best interests at heart. The changes were small, almost imperceptible at first. But then Ethan started needing us time, asking me to spend my weekends with him, encouraging me to cancel plans with friends because, after all, he was the one who really loved me. If I hesitated, he'd say things like, "I just thought you felt the same way about us," and I'd feel guilty for making him question that. He seemed so hurt that I'd end up caving, skipping out on plans with friends just to avoid his disappointment. I convinced myself it was a normal part of being in a relationship, that I'd eventually find a balance between him and everyone else. Soon, I started noticing Ethan's control over other areas of my life. He'd make little remarks about my outfits, saying things like, "I think you look beautiful in everything, but you're so classy. You don't need those flashy clothes." Or he'd suggest I wear less makeup because he liked me natural. It felt like he was shaping me to fit some mold of the perfect girlfriend, though I couldn't admit it to myself. At the time, I thought he just wanted to bring out the best in me, and maybe he knew me better than I knew myself. Then one day, I had an important presentation at work. I was excited. I'd worked hard, stayed up late preparing, and was really looking forward to it. But that morning, Ethan texted, asking if I could take a day off to spend it with him instead. He said he had a surprise, that it would mean the world if I just made the time for us. I told him I couldn't skip the presentation, and his response was immediate. "Oh, I didn't realize your job was more important than me." I felt an instant pang of guilt. I tried to explain that I'd planned this for weeks, but he barely responded the rest of the day. I spent that entire presentation half-focused, wondering if he was angry with me, if maybe I was really choosing work over love. His reaction that day should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it made me want to try harder to reassure him. He dropped comments about how he felt like I was slipping away or that he didn't understand why I always had to be so busy. I started checking in with him every few hours, feeling this silent pressure to let him know where I was and who I was with. If I got home later than expected, he'd text, "Everything okay?" But I knew he was really asking, "Why didn't you let me know?" Gradually, I became more isolated. My friends would call, ask me out, and I'd hesitate, thinking about how it would make Ethan feel. I started making excuses, telling them I was too busy, that I needed a quiet night in. The truth was, it just seemed easier to avoid any situation that might make Ethan feel insecure. One by one, the calls from friends slowed down, and weekends with family became rare. Ethan had filled every part of my life, and by then, I didn't even think it was strange. It felt normal to me, but the worst part was how he'd twist everything back on me whenever I tried to talk about it. One evening, I gathered the courage to bring up how isolated I was feeling, how I missed my friends and family. Ethan immediately looked hurt, as if I'd accused him of something terrible. He said, "I just love spending time with you, and I thought you felt the same. If you'd rather be with other people, maybe I'm not enough for you." His words hung heavy in the air, and I found myself apologizing, trying to reassure him, even though I was the one who'd been feeling isolated. Then came the breaking point, a moment that shook me in a way I couldn't ignore. I had reconnected with an old college friend, Lisa, who was passing through town. We agreed to meet for coffee, and I mentioned it to Ethan, thinking it was no big deal. But he reacted instantly, saying, "Is that what you want? Spending time with people who left you years ago?" I was stunned. He'd never been that direct before. I tried to explain that she was a close friend, but he wouldn't hear it. He called and texted repeatedly that night, asking if I still felt the same way about him. His words, his tone, they all made me feel like I was betraying him somehow. By the time I got home, I was exhausted and shaken, realizing that I'd somehow let this person occupy every part of my life and my mind. After that night, I lay awake, wondering how I'd let myself fall this deep. I thought back to all the moments I'd spent reassuring him, all the friendships I'd let drift away, and I could barely recognize myself. I was someone who'd always been independent, who'd prided myself on my own life and dreams. But with Ethan, I'd become a shadow of that person, living in constant fear of disappointing him. I started to see the pattern for what it was, how he'd slowly pulled me into a life that revolved only around him. The hardest part is I still love him, or maybe I love the person he pretended to be when we first met. But now, I'm questioning everything. I'm writing this because I need to know if anyone else has felt this way, if anyone else has been trapped in something they once thought was perfect. How did you find the strength to let go? And how do you rebuild yourself when you've given everything to someone else? I remember this one date I went on that felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. We'd matched on an app, and she seemed like a total sweetheart online. Lots of bookish selfies, pictures with her dog, captions about loving cozy nights in. Our messages were full of banter, and she even joked about wanting to live a simple life, just us and a dog. I thought she'd be a chill person who just wanted a real connection. So, we met at this low-key coffee shop on a rainy afternoon. I was all in, thinking maybe I'd found someone with similar values. She showed up a little late, but when she walked in, she looked different. Her vibe wasn't cozy or laid back at all. She was dressed in a sleek power suit, clicking over in high heels, with a phone in hand like she was closing a business deal as she ordered her coffee. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she just came straight from work. We sat down, and right away, she cut to the chase. "So, I need a guy who understands my goals and will fit into my 5-year plan. I don't have time for anything else." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she didn't laugh back. She started laying out her life like she was reading from a pitch deck. Her goals, her ideal family timeline, even her exact standards for a partner's earning potential. She asked me my credit score within the first 10 minutes, and when I stammered out a number, she made a little note on her phone. At some point, I tried to bring up something light, like my favorite movies, but she waved it off. "Oh, I don't have time for that. I only watch things that are educational or self-improvement focused." She even handed me a book she'd brought for me to read, a sort of how to optimize your life manual she swore by, and she said I should start it right away. I sat there, baffled, listening to her explain how she expected her future husband to be fully supportive of her brand, and asked how much of my time I'd be willing to devote to her. It wasn't even a date. It was a strategy session, and I was just an applicant. When she asked if I'd be open to a second meeting to discuss next steps, I realized she wasn't interested in a relationship at all. She was hiring a lifestyle partner. I left feeling like I'd been trapped in some kind of twisted job interview, wondering how someone so bookish and cozy online could actually be so intense and unyielding in real life. Then there was the woman I met at a dinner party, who seemed like the most down-to-earth person I'd met in a long time. She had this easygoing vibe, talking to everyone, laughing, and just blending in with the group like she'd known everyone for years. We started chatting, and she told me about her love for cooking, how she volunteered at a local shelter on weekends, and how she'd just gotten into gardening. I couldn't believe my luck. She was warm, caring, and seemed genuinely interested in the simple things in life. We met up a week later at a cozy restaurant. She arrived looking stunning, and I was excited to get to know her better. We started talking, and everything was going well until she suddenly turned serious and asked, "Have you ever had your aura read?" I wasn't sure if she was joking, so I smiled and shrugged, but she looked completely serious. She went on to say that she'd had her aura read just that morning and that the reader had warned her about negative energies. She started talking about how important it was for her to be with someone spiritually clean and asked if I'd be willing to have a cleansing ceremony with her spiritual advisor. I tried to steer the conversation back to something lighter, but she kept pressing, explaining that she'd just recently discovered that she was an empath and needed to be careful about who she let into her life. She asked about my birth chart, if I'd ever experienced vibrational shifts, and if I'd be open to doing a couples Reiki session. When I hesitated, she gave me this sad, knowing smile and said, "You might not be aligned with your higher purpose yet, but I think you could get there with some guidance." It was like being trapped in an infomercial for a metaphysical self-help guru. I tried to wrap things up politely, but she took it as a sign that I was closing myself off to the energy of the universe. By the end of the night, I was exhausted and a little paranoid, half convinced she'd be sending a shaman to cleanse my apartment if I didn't text her back. I left the date realizing that sometimes people are less interested in you as a person and more in who they think they can turn you into. Then there was this one woman who seemed like she was the perfect balance of fun and down to earth. We'd message back and forth, bonding over a shared love of movies and how much we both hated pretentious art galleries. We finally met at this quirky dive bar, and right from the start, she was making me laugh. She had these outrageous stories and this magnetic personality, and I was genuinely into it. We ordered a round of drinks, and she looked at me and said, "Let's make things interesting. Tell me the most insane thing you've done for someone you were dating." It felt like a fun, spontaneous date, so I went along with it, telling her about the time I'd driven 3 hours in a snowstorm just to surprise someone. She laughed and clinked her glass with mine, saying, "Challenge accepted." Things got weird when she started escalating. She kept daring me to do bolder and bolder things. First, it was to serenade her with a song right there in the bar, which I nervously did while the people around us watched, half amused, half confused. Then, she dared me to buy shots for everyone around us, and I was buzzed enough to go for it, earning us a round of cheers. But then she leaned in with this wild look in her eyes and whispered, "Let's take this to the next level. How about we just walk out without paying?" I laughed, but she wasn't joking. She actually started getting up, encouraging me to sneak out with her. That was my line. I tried to laugh it off, saying I wasn't really into stealing, but she rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, don't be boring." When I refused, she shrugged, tossed a few bills on the table with a dramatic flair, and told me she was heading to another bar because, apparently, I wasn't adventurous enough. I was left sitting there, half stunned, watching her saunter out like she'd just dropped the mic. On my way home, I couldn't help but laugh at how I'd somehow turned into the boring one for not committing petty theft. That night, I realized there are some people out there who aren't looking for romance. They're looking for someone to star in their own chaotic adventure. And as much as I thought I was up for anything, I wasn't about to be someone's partner in crime just for the thrill of it. It was one of those quiet nights where everything feels a little surreal, like the world outside is on mute and you're just floating through it. My best friend and I had been hanging out at his place. Nothing out of the ordinary. Takeout, a couple of beers, and some old playlists that made us both nostalgic. We'd known each other for years, seen each other through breakups, moves, bad jobs, and family drama. But that night, something was different. He looked at me in a way that lingered a bit too long. And when he brushed my hand, the usual, friendly gesture felt charged, like something between us had shifted into focus after being blurred for years. He noticed it too. I could tell by the way his smile softened, almost like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Before I could overthink it, we leaned into each other, and that was that. It was like crossing a threshold we hadn't dared approach before. It wasn't just a kiss either. Everything we'd shared, every inside joke, every late-night heart-to-heart seemed to flood into that moment. We knew each other so well, but there was this whole other side we were just starting to discover. We spent the night together, laughing and talking between the pauses, and it felt right in a way I couldn't explain. We fell asleep wrapped around each other, and I woke up feeling like I was seeing him for the first time. But the days that followed were awkward, to put it mildly. We didn't know how to go back to normal, but neither of us dared to bring it up. It was as if we'd agreed, silently, that acknowledging it might ruin everything. So, we stayed quiet, danced around each other, and pretended we were fine. I thought I could handle it, but it felt like there was this big, glaring truth in the room, and it was just there. I catch myself watching him, trying to read his face, wondering if he was as confused as I was. Then, out of nowhere, he started seeing someone. He told me one day as casually as if he were mentioning the weather. I felt my stomach twist, but I managed to smile, nodding along like it was no big deal. Inside, though, it was like a part of me had snapped. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just a random hookup to me, that I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. But I kept quiet, partly out of pride, partly out of fear. I didn't want to lose him, even if that meant being stuck in this awful limbo. A few weeks went by, and I noticed he was spending less and less time with me. Always busy, always preoccupied. Our texts became sparse. Quick responses instead of the usual stream of jokes and updates. Every time I saw his name light up on my phone, I felt this mix of hope and dread. But eventually, even those texts stopped coming. One night, after I'd finally worked up the nerve to ask him to talk, he told me he was getting serious with this new girl and needed to focus on her. Hearing that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. It was one thing to know he was dating. It was another to feel like he was choosing her over me, like all those years of friendship didn't mean anything. I could barely speak, but I managed to say that I understood, that I was happy for him. After I hung up, though, I sat there in the silence, trying to process everything. I never felt so foolish, so angry with myself for holding back, for thinking things could just stay the same. After that, I threw myself into anything that would distract me, work, friends, hobbies I hadn't touched in years. I convinced myself I was fine, that I didn't need him, that this was just a part of life. But every once in a while, something would remind me of him, a song, a random inside joke we shared, and I'd feel that ache all over again. It was like grieving someone who was still alive, and it hurt in a way I didn't know how to explain. Months passed, and one day, out of nowhere, he messaged me. Just a quick, friendly check-in, asking how I was doing. I wanted to ignore it, to be angry, but I couldn't. We ended up meeting for coffee, and when I saw him, it felt like no time had passed, and yet everything had changed. We talked like old friends, catching up on the little things, the big things. He mentioned his girlfriend in passing, and I noticed he kept it brief, almost cautious, as if he knew it was a sore spot. We didn't talk about that night, didn't address the gap that had grown between us. But as we hugged goodbye, he held on just a bit longer than he needed to. And in that moment, I felt this weird sense of closure, like I could finally let go of what I'd been holding on to. Maybe he did feel something that night, or maybe he didn't. Either way, I realized I couldn't keep hoping he'd come around. It took a long time to fully let go, to stop feeling that pang every time I saw his name pop up. But now, when I think of him, it's with this bittersweet affection, not the raw hurt that used to be there. I don't regret that night anymore. It was a moment we shared, something that's a part of my story, and even if it didn't turn out the way I'd hoped, it helped me understand what I want and deserve. And in some way, maybe it was exactly what I needed to finally move forward. I met Jake at a holiday work party, the kind where everyone is awkwardly sipping their drinks and trying not to talk about deadlines. I was new at the company, didn't know a soul, and was ready to slip out unnoticed. But he came up, made a joke about the decorations, and the next thing I knew, we were the last two people left still talking. I remember how he looked at me, how he seemed to listen in a way that made me feel both comfortable and wildly vulnerable at the same time. He had this uncanny ability to make me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. I went home that night thinking, wow, is this it? Our first few months together were, to put it simply, magical. He made grand gestures, weekend trips, flowers sent to my office, cooking my favorite meals. He'd write me these long, poetic messages that would pop up randomly during my workday, little I love yous hidden in my coffee cup or scrawled on a sticky note on my mirror. I fell fast. He seemed like the perfect partner, attentive, deeply caring, and so in tune with my needs. It felt like I'd stumbled into one of those love stories you hear about, but never expect to happen to you. The shift came so subtly that I couldn't put my finger on exactly when things started to change. Maybe it was the first time he raised an eyebrow, when I mentioned going out for dinner with a few friends. He'd laughed it off, but I could feel a tension in his voice when he said, "I guess I just thought you'd rather spend time with me." It sounded innocent, like he just wanted us to be together. And I wanted that too. So I canceled, thinking it was no big deal. But it didn't stop there. Before I knew it, he was showing up at my apartment unannounced, using the spare key I'd given him to let himself in whenever he felt like it. He'd leave these little surprises around, telling me he was just making it feel more like home. A mug here, a pair of slippers there. I ignored how uncomfortable it made me, pushing down the thought that my space was shrinking to make room for him. If I even hinted at feeling overwhelmed, he'd look hurt, say, "I thought this was what you wanted too." I'd end up apologizing, feeling guilty for not being more grateful for someone who was just so involved. The real signs started showing up not long after that. Jake would get quiet if I mentioned plans without him. He'd say, "I feel like you don't even need me," in this soft, broken tone, and I'd find myself reassuring him, over and over, that he was the most important part of my life. He'd sigh, then thank me, saying he was just worried I'd stop caring about him. In these moments, I felt like I was balancing on a ledge, constantly trying to reassure him, to prove my love was steady enough for the both of us. But as time went on, his concern grew sharper, more possessive. If he saw a text from someone he didn't know, he'd question me for hours, grilling me on the importance of each friend and each conversation. If I laughed at a message or smiled at my phone, he'd demand to know what was so funny and why I was keeping it from him. One night, after dinner with some old college friends, he showed up at my place looking stormy, accusing me of sneaking around and acting suspicious. It didn't matter that I'd told him about the dinner weeks in advance. His jealousy was like this insatiable monster, needing constant feeding. I tried to reason with him, to explain that my friends and family were a huge part of my life, that they weren't a threat to us. But he'd get this look, this almost empty expression, and then say, "Fine, if they're more important, go be with them." It was terrifying, like the man I loved had two sides, and I never knew which one I was going to get. One minute he was warm, affectionate, and incredibly sensitive, and the next he was cold, possessive, and almost unrecognizable. I felt like I was in this constant battle, trying to appease him while holding on to the person I used to be. The more I tried to manage his moods, the more I felt myself unraveling. He'd blame me for his bad days, saying if I really cared, I'd be more considerate, more supportive. He'd sigh and look away when I brought up anything that wasn't about him or us, his eyes narrowing as if he'd been deeply hurt. He'd say things like, "If you really loved me, you want me around all the time, or no one else would put up with you the way I do." It didn't take long before I began to internalize those words, to believe maybe he was right, maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. I started apologizing for things I'd never considered wrong before, trying harder to be what he wanted, thinking that would fix things. There was this constant tightness in my chest, a low-level anxiety that followed me everywhere. I stopped seeing friends, stopped sharing my frustrations, afraid they'd say something that would confirm my deepest fears, that I was in too deep, that I was losing myself. My world felt smaller and smaller until all that was left was him. One night, after yet another argument over something I can't even remember, I lay awake, replaying every conversation, every accusation, every apology. That's when it hit me. I didn't even recognize myself. I'd always been strong, independent, and sure of myself, but now I was barely hanging on, constantly anxious, always second-guessing every decision, every word. The realization was brutal but liberating. I started reading about toxic relationships, about emotional abuse, about how love can turn into control. It was like reading my own story, like seeing my life written out in someone else's words. For the first time, I could see his concern for what it was: manipulation disguised as affection, control cloaked in love. I reached out to a friend I hadn't seen in months, and when she asked how I was, I finally told her everything. She listened quietly, and then she said something that cut through all the excuses I'd made for him. "This isn't love. Love doesn't make you feel smaller. Love doesn't isolate you." Hearing those words out loud from someone who knew me before I met him was like a wake-up call. I realized I'd been holding on to a version of him, of us, that didn't exist anymore, maybe never had. Now, I'm standing at a crossroads, terrified but ready to take that first step toward reclaiming my life. I want to leave to start over, but it's not as simple as just walking away. Part of me feels like I'll never be the same, that I'll always carry this part of him with me, this invisible weight. But I know I have to try. So, Reddit, for those who've been in a relationship like this, how did you find the courage to leave? How did you rebuild yourself after losing so much? When I first met Chris, I wasn't even looking for a relationship. I just started a new job, moved to a new city, and figured it was a perfect chance to focus on myself for a while. But there was this spark between us that I couldn't ignore. He was funny, intelligent, and oddly familiar, like we'd known each other for years rather than days. On our first date, he told me about his volunteer work at the animal shelter and how he spent weekends reading to kids at the library. Maybe it was because I'd only ever dated guys who couldn't commit to plans past Saturday night, but I was blown away by his warmth and kindness. Green flag, I thought, with a little thrill. I'd never met anyone like him. As we got closer, things seemed to fall perfectly into place. Chris was incredibly supportive, constantly encouraging me to pursue my passions. He was always coming up with thoughtful surprises, a paint set because he remembered I loved to sketch, a playlist of music he thought I'd like. When I complained about my long commute, he offered to pick me up or drive me home when he could, just so I wouldn't have to deal with crowded trains. He seemed to genuinely care about making my life better, and in those early days, I let myself believe he was the kind of partner I'd only read about. Soon, I found myself doing things I never would have thought I'd try. Chris encouraged me to sign up for a photography class, something I'd been too scared to do alone. He'd send me lists of books he thought I'd enjoy, and we'd talk about them for hours. I was already on the edge of falling in love when he mentioned that he'd even started a little savings fund for us to travel together someday. No one had ever taken me so seriously. I felt like I'd finally found a partner, not just a boyfriend. But over time, I started noticing tiny cracks in the foundation. It started with a few offhand comments, little jokes that felt just a little too pointed. If I mentioned going out with friends, he'd say things like, "Wow, you really do have a busy social life." It was subtle, easy to brush off as humor, but the first hint of discomfort began to settle in. One day, he casually brought up my outfit choices. I'd worn a dress to brunch with a friend, and when I got back, he looked me up and down and asked, "Do you always wear that out?" I laughed it off, told him he was being silly, and moved on, but a part of me felt embarrassed. Was I too dressed up? I caught myself second-guessing, but then reminded myself of all the good things he'd done for me. Surely, one or two awkward comments didn't erase the kind, loving guy who'd been there for me from the start. The small comments and subtle criticisms kept coming, though. He would joke about how I spent so much time working on my hobbies, saying things like, "You're the busiest person I know. Always got something going on." It was like he admired me, but at the same time, wanted me to stop putting my energy into things outside of us. I kept reminding myself how thoughtful he'd been, how supportive he was. This was the guy who'd spent hours building a travel itinerary for a trip we hadn't even planned yet. Surely, that couldn't be a bad thing. But one night, things changed. I had plans to go out with some coworkers, and as I was getting ready, Chris was unusually quiet. I asked if something was wrong, but he brushed it off, saying he just felt left out sometimes. I offered to cancel, but he insisted I go, saying he didn't want to be the kind of boyfriend who held me back. But as I walked out the door, he gave me this strange, sad smile, like I'd disappointed him somehow. The whole night, I couldn't relax, couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let him down. I came home early, hoping to talk to him about it, but he'd gone to bed, leaving a text. "Hope you had fun. Missed you tonight." From then on, he made small adjustments in the way we spent time together. He'd surprise me in my office after work or suggest spontaneous dates on nights he knew I usually hung out with friends. He started showing up to my classes, saying he wanted to support me, even if I hadn't asked him to. I loved seeing him, of course, but sometimes it felt like he was inserting himself into every aspect of my life. And though I felt guilty even thinking it, there were moments I just wanted a little space. Then came the evening that tore my perspective wide open. My best friend, Sarah, was visiting from out of town, and we'd planned a girls' night, just the two of us. But right as we were about to head out, Chris texted, saying he had a surprise and was waiting outside my place. I was torn. I didn't want to disappoint him, but I also didn't want to let Sarah down. When I went out to talk to him, he gave me this wounded look and said, "It's like you don't want me to be part of your life tonight." I tried to explain that I just wanted time with my friend, but he kept insisting he didn't mind tagging along. I could feel my frustration boiling up, but I didn't want to start an argument in front of Sarah. Finally, after an awkward standoff, he left. But that night, the guilt gnawed at me. Was I really wrong for wanting time with friends? Had I been selfish? A week later, things took an even darker turn. I was working late, and when I finally checked my phone, I had 10 missed calls and a series of texts from Chris, all escalating from, "Hey, just checking into, is there a reason you're ignoring me?" When I called him back, he sounded hurt, even a little accusatory, asking why I hadn't at least let him know I'd be busy. I apologized, explained my work situation, but the conversation left me feeling like I'd done something wrong, like my own life was becoming a betrayal. It was around that time that the picture of who he was started to shift. I realized I was constantly anxious, carefully wording texts, adjusting plans, and managing his expectations, just to keep the peace. The guy who'd once seemed so supportive now felt like he was quietly monitoring every part of my life. My hobbies, my friends, even my family, it all seemed to make him feel threatened, and I couldn't figure out why. The final straw came one evening after I'd gone out with a co-worker to celebrate a promotion. When I got home, Chris was sitting outside my apartment. I was startled, and before I could even say anything, he asked, "How was it?" His tone was tight, his face unreadable. I told him it was just a work thing, but he kept pressing, asking why I hadn't invited him, why I'd chosen to celebrate without him. I tried to explain that it was a last-minute decision, but he looked at me with this intensity, like he was searching for a lie. Finally, he said, "It's like I don't even know who you are sometimes." That hit me hard. I realized he had started to define every part of me as something that belonged to him. My friends, my time, my accomplishments. He saw them all as things he should control, even if he was kind enough to disguise it as care. In the end, I knew I had to leave, though it was one of the hardest choices I'd ever made. Walking away from the guy who'd once felt like the love of my life wasn't something I'd expected to face. The mixed signals, the green flags that had shifted, the red flags I'd ignored, left me wondering if I'd ever been able to see him clearly at all. So now I'm here, writing this, wondering how we're supposed to tell the difference between genuine love and love that tries to keep you trapped. How do we know when someone's kindness is real or when it's just a cover for control? I'd love to hear from anyone who's been in this strange, confusing space where green fades into red. I'll never forget this moment at a little dog park where I'd taken my sister's golden retriever for a walk. I'm there just throwing a tennis ball and watching this fluffy bundle of energy bound around, when I hear this voice behind me say, "That dog's got way more stamina than me." I turn, and there's this guy with a scruffy little terrier who looks like he's been out of breath for hours. He grins, nodding at the golden retriever, and says, "Pretty sure he's faster than I am, too." His easygoing attitude cracked me up, and without even thinking, I replied, "Yeah, this guy's a pro. His workout plan is way more intense than mine." The guy didn't jump into asking for my name or number, and he didn't suddenly start showering me with compliments. He just rolled with the topic and stayed on this hilarious tangent about dog fitness levels. It wasn't until we'd been chatting for a while, laughing about the wild personalities of our dogs, that he said, "So, are you a regular here, or just the designated dog aunt today?" There was something so relaxed about him, like he genuinely didn't care about the right things to say. He was just having a fun conversation. By the time we parted ways, I was surprised to feel a little sad we didn't exchange numbers. But he'd left an impression because he kept it real, never pushed for anything, and just shared the moment. On the other end of the spectrum was this strange encounter at a coffee shop where I'd gone to enjoy some quiet reading time. I'm sitting there with a book, earbuds in, fully absorbed, when this guy comes up and literally stands in front of me, hands on his hips, waiting. When I looked up, startled, he did this half smile and said, "Hey, that book must be good if it's keeping your attention away from a guy like me." I had to suppress a cringe because he genuinely seemed to think he was being charming, not reading the room or my obvious discomfort. He went on to say, "How about you put that book down and have coffee with someone a little more interesting?" I tried to politely say I was just enjoying some downtime, but he kept leaning into the conversation like his goal was to wear me down. After a few more forced attempts at being clever, I finally had to put my headphones back in and hope he got the hint. Moments like these make you appreciate the guys who understand what personal space and a simple no thanks mean. The truth is, you shouldn't have to defend your alone time or feel pressured into conversation just because you're in public. If someone seems absorbed in something, maybe assume they're there for a reason and respect it. One of my favorite approaches happened at a bookstore during a sale event. I was browsing the mystery section, checking out this old paperback, when I hear someone say, "That author? Guaranteed to keep you up all night reading," and also kind of terrified. I looked over, and this guy is just standing there with a book in his hand, looking completely serious. It was such a funny way to start a conversation that I found myself responding, "Really? That's exactly what I need." Sleep deprivation and horror. The cool thing was, he didn't jump into a pickup line or try to flirt heavily. He was just genuinely enthusiastic about books and wanted to share his thoughts. We ended up talking about the plot twists we loved and hated in different genres, trading book recommendations like old friends. It felt like he saw me as a fellow book nerd first and a possible romantic interest second, which made the whole interaction comfortable and refreshing. When he eventually asked if I'd like to grab coffee sometime, it felt natural, like an extension of the conversation rather than an interruption. And by then, I already knew I was interested. The best encounters I've had are the ones where someone respects that I'm my own person with my own life, and they don't try to push or make demands. They give you space to engage or disengage, and when it's done right, you actually want to stay and talk. It's about connecting over something real, not trying to force a spark that may or may not be there. If you can bring a sense of ease and respect into the conversation, you've already set yourself apart. It all started with a casual plan to grab drinks, just a typical Friday night. No agenda, no expectations. I was with a group of friends, each of us with the same goal: to shake off the week, let loose, and just enjoy the night. The bar was packed, the energy electric. Somewhere between our second and third round, I spotted him, a guy who stood out in the crowd, effortlessly charming with a subtle confidence that made it impossible to ignore him. Our eyes met, and I felt that instant pull. You know the feeling, right? That strange chemistry that you can't explain, the kind that makes you feel bold and alive. After a while, he made his way over, and we started talking. The connection was there immediately. We laughed at each other's jokes, shared stories like old friends, and the tension between us grew with every word. At some point, we found ourselves on the dance floor, close, swaying to the music as if the rest of the world had faded away. The thrill of the moment felt intoxicating, a kind of excitement I hadn't felt in ages. And then, without even really deciding, we slipped out together, sneaking glances and stolen kisses on the way to his place. It was spontaneous, wild, and it felt perfect. The night was everything you'd imagine in a scene like that. Intense, exciting, with every nerve awake and alive. We lost ourselves in each other, and for a few hours, it was like nothing else mattered. The world outside didn't exist. It was just the two of us, caught up in something unplanned and wonderfully reckless. But as the night turned into early morning, the energy began to shift. When the passion ebbed, a strange silence settled in, one that I tried to ignore but couldn't shake. He drifted off to sleep, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and feeling a mix of emotions I hadn't expected. I felt both exhilarated and empty, a kind of loneliness that felt sharper than usual. I didn't know why. I should have been able to leave, to walk away without a second thought like I had with other flings. But for some reason, this time felt different. In the dim morning light, everything seemed to look different too, like the excitement of the night had somehow dulled into something else, something a little sad. As quietly as I could, I got dressed, slipped on my shoes, and found my way to the door. I thought about leaving a note, maybe some cute little message. But why? He'd likely forget my name by the end of the weekend, just as I'd forget his. That was the agreement, wasn't it? No strings, no promises. Still, as I closed the door behind me, I felt the strange sting of something close to regret, like I'd left a piece of myself back there in his apartment, a piece I hadn't meant to give. Walking home, I kept thinking about the night, about how often I'd thrown myself into these kinds of nights, hoping they'd leave me feeling empowered and free. And sure, sometimes they did, but this time, all I felt was hollow, like I was chasing something I couldn't quite catch. By the time I got back to my own place, the sun was rising, and with it came a clarity I hadn't felt before. Maybe I was searching for something more, something real, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. A few days later, I met up with one of my closest friends and ended up spilling the whole story. She listened, nodding with a knowing smile, and when I finished, she leaned over and said, "You know, we're all chasing connection. Sometimes we find it, and sometimes we just get close enough to remember what we really want." Her words hit hard. Maybe that was it. Maybe these hookups were just little glimpses of connection, but not enough to fill the void I'd been trying to ignore. The funny thing is, I've always thought of myself as someone who didn't need anything serious. I used to laugh off the idea of settling down, proud of my independence and my freedom. But now I was starting to wonder if I'd been hiding behind that independence. Had I been telling myself I didn't want love just because I was scared to admit that I actually did? That question lingered, gnawing at me in a way I couldn't ignore. Since that night, I've been thinking differently. It's not that I'm done with fun, not by any means, but I'm more aware now, more honest with myself about what I'm really looking for. I want the spark, sure, but I also want someone who stays. I want a connection that doesn't disappear with the sunrise. It's taken me a while to admit it, but maybe I'm ready for something that's real, something that doesn't leave me feeling like I'm the only one awake in the middle of the night, searching for something more. In a way, that night changed me. It made me realize that sometimes what we think we want isn't what we need, and what we need might be something we've been afraid to admit. I'll always remember that night, not because of him, but because of what it taught me about myself. I used to think that freedom meant no attachments, no commitments. But now I see that true freedom is being honest about what you want, even if it means letting go of what no longer serves you. So no regrets, just a newfound clarity and a sense of purpose I didn't have before. I'm still open to the thrill of the unknown, but now I'm also open to the possibility of something deeper. For the first time, I'm letting myself want what I want, and that feels like the bravest thing I've done yet. I was fresh out of college, not long into my first real job, and feeling the weight of adulthood hit me like a ton of bricks. One Friday, my high school buddy Tom invited me to his place for a small reunion party. We'd kept in touch, but hadn't seen each other in ages, so I was excited. I was one of the last to arrive, and when I walked in, Tom greeted me with a bear hug and introduced me to a few friends and some people from his job. It felt like a return to the simpler, easy days, and I settled in right away, drinks flowing as we reminisced. It wasn't until later that I noticed Tom's mom, Claire, mingling with us. I didn't remember her being around at these kinds of gatherings back in high school. She was more of a background presence, always smiling, but keeping her distance, and she usually headed upstairs if we had people over. But now, she was right there, glass of wine in hand, laughing with us. It took me by surprise. She looked completely different. Her hair was cut short and stylish, her outfit sleek and confident, nothing like the modest, quiet woman I remembered. She looked like she belonged, not just at the party, but in the crowd of 20-somethings gathered around her. After a while, Claire and I ended up chatting by the kitchen, catching up. She asked about college, work, and what I'd been up to. Our conversation went from casual to surprisingly personal. We started talking about books, life in the city, and somehow drifted into deeper territory. She told me about how she had spent years raising Tom and his siblings, sacrificing her own dreams until now. There was a calm wisdom in her voice, the kind that draws you in without even trying. As we talked, I found myself studying her face, noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The small freckle just above her lip, the spark in her eyes when she laughed. I'd always known her as Tom's mom, but here she was, opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I could feel an unspoken shift between us, like the air around us was changing, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. Then, as the party wound down and people started leaving, Tom and the others got into this heated discussion about some new movie, and Claire quietly excused herself, giving me a small smile as she stepped out onto the back patio. Without really thinking, I grabbed another drink and followed her outside. The night was cool and quiet, a soft breeze rustling the leaves, and we just stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between us. "I don't know if it's too late to say this," she said finally, glancing at me, "but I'm glad you and Tom stayed close all these years. He's lucky to have a friend like you." There was something vulnerable in her tone, something that made me feel like we were suddenly alone, miles away from everyone else. Honestly, I think I'm the lucky one, I replied, feeling a little shy under her gaze. You've always been like family. She laughed softly, her eyes dropping to her glass. I appreciate that, she murmured. But sometimes family is exactly what holds us back. Sometimes we need people who see us as, something different. Her words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. The distance between us felt electric, like we were on the edge of something we couldn't quite define. Without knowing why, I reached out and touched her hand, a light, hesitant brush that lingered just a second too long. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment, we were both perfectly still. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, we leaned in, our lips meeting in a soft, tentative kiss. It felt both completely natural and wildly unexpected, a connection that neither of us had planned but couldn't resist. I felt her hand on my shoulder, gentle yet firm, and suddenly nothing else mattered. Just the quiet, warm night and the feeling of her lips against mine. When we finally broke apart, there was a strange mix of emotions on her face, surprise, maybe a bit of guilt, but also something close to relief. I didn't plan this, she whispered, as if to herself more than to me. Neither did I replied, my voice barely audible. But I'm not sure I regret it. We stood there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other, caught in this strange, unexpected intimacy. Eventually, we stepped back, the spell broken by the faint sounds of laughter from inside the house. After that night, things were different. I found myself thinking about her constantly, replaying that kiss in my mind, wondering if it had been as real as it felt. I knew it couldn't last, knew that this strange, forbidden connection was something neither of us could afford, but I couldn't let it go. I'd run into her occasionally at Tom's place. A quick, shared glance and a nod, the memory of that night passing between us like a secret. A few weeks later, she texted me, saying she needed to talk. We met at a small coffee shop a few towns over, somewhere no one would recognize us. She looked nervous, her fingers tapping lightly against her cup as she searched for words. I don't think this thing between us, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It can't happen again. It was a moment, a wonderful, confusing, beautiful moment, but that's all it can be. I nodded, feeling my heart sink, but knowing she was right. I understand, I said, though my voice was thick with regret. But I need you to know, it meant something to me. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine, a sad smile on her face. Me too, she replied, her eyes glistening with something that looked a lot like tears. But Tom, he's my son, and you're his best friend. I can't risk losing that. With those words, we parted ways, each of us carrying the weight of that memory, a moment suspended in time. We never spoke about it again, and life moved on, as it always does. Tom and I remained friends, though there was always a faint sense of something unspoken, something I couldn't explain. Years passed, and Claire eventually met someone new, someone who treated her well and gave her the happiness she deserved. I saw her occasionally, always with a polite smile and a quick, courteous nod, each of us pretending that nothing had ever happened. But I knew that night would always be with me, a small, private secret tucked away in the back of my mind, a reminder of a connection that was brief, beautiful, and utterly unforgettable. Even now, years later, I think back to that kiss on the patio, the warmth of her hand in mine, the soft, shared breath between us. It was a moment that existed outside of rules, outside of reason, a fleeting, impossible connection that neither of us would ever fully forget. Ethan and I have been together for 2 years, and for most of that time, I would have sworn we had the kind of relationship everyone wants. We were that couple who knew each other's coffee orders, who took spontaneous road trips, who had a playlist of our songs that we'd listen to on lazy Sunday mornings. It felt easy and right, like finding home in another person. We'd make all these plans for the future, and for once, I could actually see it, our life together, little details and all. It felt so stable and comforting. But then things changed. It started so gradually that I didn't even realize at first. Ethan started coming home a little later each night, which he blamed on work deadlines. He worked in marketing, so I knew how high pressure it could be, but this was different. He used to text me updates during the day, just small things, a funny meme, a photo of his lunch, or even just a thinking of you. But those messages became sparse, like he was suddenly too busy for those small touches we used to have. And when he did come home, he was different. It was in the little things, like the way he'd give me a quick peck on the cheek instead of our usual hug. Or how, during dinner, he'd seem distracted, his eyes looking past me instead of at me. He'd eat in silence or give one-word answers, like he was talking to a stranger and not me, the person he'd confided in about everything from work stress to childhood memories. I'd look across the table, searching his face, hoping for a glimpse of the person I fell in love with. But it was like he was somewhere else. Then one day, he started keeping his phone on silent, always face down on the counter. It buzzed a lot, especially in the evenings, but whenever I'd glance at it, he'd give me a quick "it's just work" and turn it off. My mind started racing. Was he hiding something? Was I just paranoid? I told myself it was just work stress, that I needed to be supportive, not jump to conclusions. But those little things kept piling up, and no matter how much I tried to ignore them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started to question myself. Was I being needy? Was I overreacting? But I'd catch him staring off into the distance, barely responding when I asked him simple questions. If I mentioned plans for the weekend or tried to talk about our upcoming trip, he'd brush it off or say, "Let's figure it out later," like even talking about the future was too much to deal with. The once effortless connection we shared now felt forced, like I was reaching across a widening chasm that he didn't seem to want to bridge. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after he canceled yet another date night at the last minute, I decided to confront him. He'd come home late, saying he was exhausted, and went straight to the couch without even glancing my way. I stood there, watching him, feeling my heart pounding, and gathered the courage to sit down beside him. "Ethan," I started, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's going on?" He looked at me, a little confused. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words without letting my voice shake. "You've been so distant lately. You're always working late, you barely talk to me, and it's like I'm not even here." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm sorry. Work has just been really intense. I don't mean to make you feel that way." "I get that," I said, keeping my tone gentle. "But it feels like it's more than just work. You used to talk to me about things, even the small stuff. Now it feels like you're shutting me out. Is there something you're not telling me?" He hesitated, looking down at his hands, and I could feel the tension in the room grow. It's not like that. I just have a lot on my mind. Is it something we can talk about? I want to help you if I can," I offered, reaching out to put my hand on his. But he pulled his hand away, so quickly that it felt like a slap, leaving me stunned and a little hurt. I need some space," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. Space? The word hung in the air, heavy and confusing. He'd never asked for space before, never even hinted at needing time apart. In fact, he used to say that I was the only person who made him feel at ease, the one place he could escape to. And now, suddenly, he needed space from me? "Ethan," I said softly, my voice barely holding steady. "If you need space, I'll give it to you. But I need to know what's happening here. I can't be in a relationship where I feel like I'm the only one trying to make it work." He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor like he was somewhere else entirely. And the silence that stretched between us felt final, like there was no coming back from it. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, but his words didn't offer any comfort. "I don't know what I want right now. I thought I did, but I just need time." It felt like my heart had been wrenched from my chest. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him tell me why he was slipping away from me, why he'd suddenly changed. But all I could do was sit there, staring at this person who had once been my best friend, my partner, my everything, and wonder where it had all gone wrong. We sat in silence for a while after that. I felt 1,000 things at once: hurt, confusion, anger, and this gnawing feeling of helplessness. I wanted so badly to understand what he was feeling, to bridge the distance between us, but it was clear he wasn't going to let me in. He got up after a while and mumbled something about needing to clear his head. And just like that, he walked out the door, leaving me alone with nothing but questions. I stayed up that night, replaying our entire relationship in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed, wondering if there was something I'd done to push him away. But I couldn't find a single answer. We'd been so close, so deeply connected, and now it was like he was a stranger. I'm left with this aching uncertainty, this feeling of being in a relationship with someone I don't even know anymore. Part of me wants to believe that we can fix this, that maybe he just needs time to work through whatever he's dealing with. But another part of me wonders if I'm just clinging to the past, to the person he used to be. I don't know where we go from here. I don't even know if we're still us. How do you hold on to someone who doesn't want to be held? How do you trust again when everything feels like it's slipping away? Has anyone been through this? Can you save a relationship when you're not sure if the other person even wants to? Because right now, I feel like I'm fighting a battle I don't know how to win. It happened on a Sunday morning, one of those lazy ones where we'd usually make breakfast together. I'd woken up feeling light, optimistic even, and as I walked into the kitchen, I saw him staring out the window, lost in thought. I reached over, trying to be playful, and tapped him on the shoulder. Lost in space. I teased, grinning. He turned to me, looked a little startled, and gave a flat smile. "Just thinking," he said, then turned back to his coffee. I felt the coldness of his words sink in, but I tried to shake it off, hoping it was just a mood. I cracked a joke about needing coffee to handle another workday tomorrow, expecting him to play along. But he shrugged, muttering, "Must be nice not to have real responsibilities." I froze. I work in marketing, a job that can be hectic and challenging in its own way, but I knew he'd never really respected it. He had a high-pressure job in finance, and over time, little comments like this had started creeping into our conversations. I laughed it off, trying to keep things light. "Well, it keeps the bills paid." But instead of letting it slide, he smirked. "Maybe, but it's not exactly saving the world, is it?" I could feel my cheeks burning, but I held my tongue. I knew pushing back would just make him dig in harder. And lately, that's how most of our conversations felt, like I had to walk on eggshells to avoid his judgment. When he first started saying things like that, I told myself he was just teasing, that he didn't mean it seriously. But each comment piled on top of the last, and I couldn't help feeling like he saw me as small, lesser. My thoughts and ambitions didn't seem to matter to him. By the time breakfast was over, I felt like we'd been speaking two different languages. I tried to shake off the tension, but it clung to me like fog refusing to lift. He was right there with me, but emotionally, I felt like I was sitting across from a stranger. Days went by, and things only got worse. Every interaction started feeling forced, like there was a wall between us that neither of us knew how to break down. I'd share something about my day, a funny story from work, and his eyes would glaze over. He'd say, "That's nice," or "cool," without any real interest. But when he talked about his work, his eyes would light up, and he'd launch into lengthy explanations. I'd listen, nodding along, but the more he talked, the more I realized he wasn't really looking for my thoughts. He just wanted an audience. I tried to remind myself that maybe he was going through a rough time, or maybe he didn't mean to seem so distant. I even made an effort to be more patient, holding back my own stories so he wouldn't feel interrupted. But no matter how hard I tried, I felt myself becoming invisible, like my presence was a background noise he could tune out whenever he chose. I'd ask if he wanted to go out, maybe have a date night, and he'd wave it off. "Let's save some money, maybe next week." But next week would come and go, and the suggestion would hang in the air, ignored and forgotten. I felt like I was the only one holding on, hoping for some glimpse of the warmth we'd had before. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I'd been rehearsing what I wanted to say, trying to find the right words that would finally break through. As we were getting ready for bed, I took a deep breath and asked, "Can we talk?" He gave me a look, one that seemed to say, "Again with the talking?" But I pushed forward, my voice shaking. "I just feel like we're not connecting anymore. It's like I'm here, but you barely see me. And when I talk, it feels like you're not even interested." He looked at me for a long time, then shook his head, exasperated. "You're overthinking this. Not every moment has to be some deep conversation, you know? I could feel my heart sink. I wasn't asking for deep conversations. I was asking to feel seen, like my words mattered to him. I know that, I replied, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. But it feels like I'm the only one putting in any effort. Like you're here, but you're not really here with me. He sighed, rubbing his temples, looking more annoyed than anything else. You make it sound like I don't care, but you don't need me to hang on every word. People in real relationships don't do that. I was speechless. Real relationships? How could he say that when I'd been bending over backward trying to hold us together? So a real relationship means ignoring each other? I asked quietly, not sure if I even wanted to hear the answer. No, he said, but his tone was flat and different. It means being comfortable. It's normal for people to get busy, to have their own lives. That last sentence was the final crack. I've been trying so hard to share my life with him, to feel like we were a team, but every word, every shrug, made it clear that he saw our time together as an afterthought, something to fit in around everything else. The days after that were filled with a quiet kind of dread. I started avoiding him, afraid of more of the same dismissive replies. I'd tiptoe around topics, asking quick, safe questions that wouldn't stir anything up. We became roommates, polite but distant, both holding back for fear of more hurt. We'd sit together side by side, yet worlds apart. It was a lonely kind of intimacy, where everything I wanted to say was trapped inside me. Every attempt to reach out was met with a closed door. Finally, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. Late one night, after lying awake in the dark for hours, I asked myself if this was how I wanted to live. I didn't want to keep shrinking, becoming smaller just to fit into his idea of what was acceptable. I didn't want to feel invisible anymore. So, here I am, laying it out to you all. I've tried talking, I've tried being patient, I've tried being what I thought he needed. But nothing's changing. It feels like I'm reaching out to a brick wall, hoping it'll turn into a person who can see me again. Has anyone been through this before? Is there a way to fix communication when one person just doesn't seem to care? Or am I holding on to something that's already gone? I'm not really one to share my private life online, but I don't know where else to turn. Lately, it feels like I'm standing in the middle of my relationship, calling his name, and all I get back is an echo. I don't know how we got here, and I can't tell if it's just a rough patch or something more final. It started with little things. A month ago, we had this tradition of winding down on Sunday mornings together. We'd make coffee, listen to some music, and just chat about our week. It was like our reset button, a chance to reconnect after our busy schedules. But that morning, I woke up to find him already up and buried in his phone, scrolling through endless notifications. I thought, okay, maybe he's dealing with something for work. But even when I joined him on the couch, coffee in hand, he barely looked up, giving me this half smile before going back to whatever had his attention. It left this strange, hollow feeling in me, like we were right there together, yet worlds apart. Since then, it's like everything's been out of sync. I can't remember the last time he reached for my hand or pulled me into one of his spontaneous hugs. He used to leave little notes around the house for me to find a quick "I love you" on the bathroom mirror or a doodle of us on the grocery list. It was silly, but those notes used to make me feel like we had our own little language. Now, it feels like that language has faded, like he's speaking a different one, and I'm left trying to decode it. But the confusing part is he'll still have these moments where he's so attentive and caring. It throws me off. Just last week, I'd had a terrible day at work, and he surprised me with a bottle of my favorite wine and these macarons from a bakery I love across town. He even set up a little movie night for us in the living room, complete with blankets and fairy lights. It was thoughtful, and for a couple of hours it felt like old times. But the next day, he was distant again, barely saying more than a few words as he rushed out the door, his phone glued to his hand. And that's what's really messing with me, the inconsistency. One moment, he's right there, looking at me like I'm the only person in the room. The next, he's a million miles away, locked inside his own head. I keep wondering if I did something to push him away, or if he's carrying something he doesn't want to tell me about. It's hard not to think back to when we first started dating. Back then, he couldn't go a day without texting or calling just to hear my voice or tell me something random. We'd talk for hours, and he'd go out of his way to make me feel like I was his priority. We had our own inside jokes, a running list of places we wanted to explore together, and this easy flow between us that felt like it could go on forever. But now, that ease is gone. I feel like I'm chasing after him, trying to find the right moment to bring this up, but every time I get close, he shuts down or brushes it off with, "I'm just tired," or "Work's been crazy." I keep thinking it's just temporary stress, that he'll come around, but how long am I supposed to wait? At what point does this stop being a phase and start being a pattern? Finally, last night I hit my breaking point. We were sitting in the car after grabbing some takeout, just parked outside our building. The silence between us felt heavy, like there was this unspoken wall between us. I took a deep breath and just went for it. "Are we okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked over at me, his eyes softening for a second, and for a moment, I thought he was going to tell me everything to finally let me in. But then he sighed and turned back to stare out the windshield. "I don't know," he said. "I think I'm just going through some things. I need some time to figure it out." And just like that, he closed the door again. No explanation, no real answers. Just this vague confession that left me feeling more uncertain than ever. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to say, "Tell me what's really going on." But I didn't. I just nodded like I understood, even though I didn't. Now, I'm lying here, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I got to this point. Wondering if the man I fell in love with is still in there, or if he's already halfway gone. And I'm just the last one to figure it out. I don't know if I'm supposed to keep holding on, hoping he'll come back to me, or if I'm just grasping at memories. How do you know when someone's really going through something versus when they've already made up their mind? How do you tell if it's just a phase, or if you're watching your relationship slip through your fingers? If anyone's been here before, please tell me how you figured it out. Because right now, I feel like I'm watching him drift away, and I don't know how to pull him back, or if I even should. The first time I noticed it was after an offhand comment I made, one I didn't think twice about at the time. We were getting ready for a friend's wedding, and as Sarah was finishing her hair, she asked me how she looked. I told her she looked stunning, but added with a smile, "You're always the perfectionist, huh?" She stopped mid-hairspray, staring at me through the mirror, and I could see her shoulders stiffen. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, with a tightness in her voice that threw me off. I chuckled, trying to play it down. "I just mean, you always want things just right. You've got an eye for detail." But instead of relaxing, she pursed her lips and went back to fixing her hair without a word. I brushed it off as wedding stress, but something felt off. We barely spoke the rest of the evening. After that night, it felt like there was a new layer of silence between us. In the beginning, it was subtle. I'd come home and talk about my day, just casual stuff, work frustrations, or a funny story from lunch. She'd nod, but her replies seemed flat, like she was going through the motions. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd shrug and say she was tired or busy. One night, I tried opening up about a rough project at work, thinking maybe if I showed her some vulnerability, she'd feel closer to me again. But instead of comforting me, she started giving suggestions, telling me how I could approach things differently. The conversation took this weird turn where I felt like I was being criticized for not handling things her way. Sometimes I just need to vent, I said, trying to sound casual, even though I felt my patience fraying. She looked genuinely surprised. "I'm just trying to help. You're always saying things are stressful, so I thought I'll let it go," even though I wanted to say that's not the point. I wanted her to see how it felt to not have my own thoughts and feelings acknowledged for what they were. Over the next few weeks, the same thing kept happening. Little things I said seemed to set her off, and any time I tried to explain myself, I'd end up feeling even more misunderstood. I noticed myself getting quieter around her, filtering everything I said to avoid any chance of conflict. I catch myself second-guessing, thinking, will she take this the wrong way? Is this going to turn into another argument? One day, when we were making plans for the weekend, I suggested we spend a low-key day at the beach, just the two of us. She rolled her eyes and said, "Isn't that kind of boring?" I swallowed my frustration and asked what she wanted to do instead. And she rattled off a list of her friends' plans, brunch spots, and events that sounded more like her idea of a perfect day than mine. She could sense I wasn't into it, and after a moment, she just sighed, "Fine, we'll do your thing." It felt like a punch. I didn't want to spend the day together out of some reluctant compromise. I wanted it to be something we both wanted. but saying that would only cause an argument, so I stayed quiet. I was trying so hard to avoid conflict that I barely recognized myself anymore. Every time we were together, I felt like I was fading, like I was censoring who I was to keep the peace. I felt more alone with her than when I was actually alone. There was this one night that really stuck with me. She was out late with her friends, and I was home, replaying one of our recent fights in my head. It was another conversation that had spiraled into an argument about expectations. I'd said I felt like she was always prioritizing her friends over us, and she'd accused me of being needy and controlling. As I sat there, I realized something. I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a good conversation, one where I felt like she was really listening, where I didn't feel like I was on trial for just having feelings. It was like I was constantly fighting to be seen and heard, only to feel like I was being dismissed or trivialized. In that quiet moment, I started to wonder if maybe this was just who she was. She was great at talking about what mattered to her, but when it came to my feelings, it was like there was an invisible wall, one I couldn't break through. I felt selfish for thinking it, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe we were two people who loved each other but didn't know how to truly connect. The breaking point came one weekend when we decided to tackle a small house project together. I'd been looking forward to it, hoping it'd be something we could bond over, but almost immediately things started going wrong. She kept second-guessing my suggestions, and I found myself biting back comments just to keep the peace. Eventually, I got frustrated and told her, "I feel like I can't say anything without you taking it as criticism." She put down her tools and gave me this cold look. "Maybe it's because you're always so critical. Nothing I do is ever good enough for you. Is it?" It was like she'd slapped me. I stared at her, feeling this weight in my chest, this sadness I couldn't shake. "Sarah, that's not true. I just want us to actually listen to each other." She crossed her arms, clearly done with the conversation. "Well, maybe you should stop trying to fix me and accept me as I am." I felt this tightness in my throat, this urge to say all the things I've been holding back, but I didn't. I knew it would only make things worse, so I took a breath, turned away, and went to the other room. We finished the project in silence, and when it was over, I just wanted to be anywhere but near her. Since then, I've felt this persistent emptiness between us. I realized I'd been holding on to this idea of who we could be together, but the reality was starting to feel like a version of myself I didn't recognize, quiet, invisible, always apologizing, always trying to keep things smooth at the expense of my own peace. I've started to ask myself hard questions I've been avoiding. Is this just a rough patch, or are we fundamentally incompatible? Do I keep hoping she'll change, or do I need to accept that maybe this is who she really is, and that our communication styles are just too different? I still love her, but it's getting harder to ignore this feeling of loneliness that I never expected to feel while in a relationship. I keep wondering if I'm just not trying hard enough, or if maybe, deep down, we're two people who want different things from each other. So, here I am, feeling lost and wondering if anyone else has been through something like this. How do you know when it's time to let go, or if there's a way to rebuild trust and real communication? Is there even a way to fix a relationship where it feels like the other person is always missing the... It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. We'd just had dinner, a quiet meal that felt like every other, filled with clinking forks and silence stretching too long between words. I don't even remember what we talked about, but after we'd finished eating, she cleared her plate, paused, and then looked at me like she was about to tell me a secret. Her face softened with something that looked almost like pity. "I don't think I can do this anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart sank. She didn't even sound angry, just tired, as if she'd been rehearsing the words for a while. I tried to ask why, but my throat closed up, the words sticking like glue. And in that split second, it all crashed over me. Things I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The months of distance, the way she'd avoided eye contact, the times we'd sat inches apart but felt miles away. It was like watching someone turn a light off, leaving me in the dark and knowing they'd gone. That night, I lay on the couch, trying to make sense of how we'd ended up here. It didn't add up. This was the woman I'd built dreams with, the one who knew my childhood stories, who'd whispered, "I love you" more times than I could count. I'd thought we were forever. When we met, I'd been captivated. She'd walked into my life like a flash of color in a grayscale world. She was the girl who danced barefoot at concerts, who cried at movie trailers, who once dragged me out of bed at midnight to watch a meteor shower on a chilly autumn night. There was a spark in her that made everything around her seem brighter, and I was in awe of it. We moved in together fast, maybe too fast, but it felt right, you know? I thought, this is what love is supposed to feel like. We spent our early days together like kids discovering a secret world. Every weekend was an adventure, from Sunday markets to late-night drives where we'd just talk and listen to music, sharing dreams and fears. She'd tell me I was her anchor, and I'd joke that she was my storm. We balanced each other, or at least I thought we did. I never imagined the storms would get harder to weather. Looking back, I can see the cracks that started to form. There were tiny things at first, missed phone calls, forgotten plans. I told myself it was normal, that people grew comfortable, that love changed shape as the years went on. But soon, I'd catch her drifting off during our conversations, her gaze somewhere far away. Sometimes I'd ask her if she was okay, and she'd just nod, give me a tight smile, and say, "Yeah, just tired." At first, I tried to fix it. I planned dates, surprise getaways, movie nights, anything to bring back that spark. I remember one time I set up a whole picnic in the living room because it was pouring outside, complete with her favorite wine and candles. She laughed, but it was strained, like she was humoring me. She stayed on her phone most of the time, glancing up occasionally but never really present. I could feel her slipping away, but I kept trying, determined not to lose her, even though a part of me knew I already had. Eventually, I brought up couples counseling, desperate to find some way to bridge the distance. She agreed, but reluctantly. We went to 3 sessions, and every time, I'd walk out feeling like I was dragging us both through mud, like I was trying to save a version of us she no longer believed in. In one session, she finally looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I don't even know who I am with you anymore." It hit like a punch to the gut. I realized that whatever spark we'd once shared had become something that only I was holding on to. After that, we slipped into a silent routine. We coexisted more than we lived together. Some nights, I'd lie awake beside her, watching the ceiling, my mind racing with memories of when things had been good, wondering how we'd gotten so lost. I'd listen to her steady breathing, feeling the distance between us as a tangible thing, a chasm that words couldn't bridge. Finally, that Tuesday came, and I felt like I'd been sleepwalking through my life, waiting for the inevitable. We sat across from each other, talking logistics, dividing up the pieces of our shared life. She took her books and the painting we'd bought on a weekend trip to the coast. I kept the kitchen table we'd spent hours around, the one I'd sanded down myself and built with my own hands. It felt strange, deciding who got what, like we were disassembling a dream piece by piece. After she left, the quiet settled in like a weight. Every corner of the apartment felt haunted. I'd find myself staring at the empty space where her things used to be, my mind filling in the gaps with memories. I stopped cooking for a while, eating takeout instead because it felt weird to use the pots and pans we'd bought together. Our kitchen, once filled with laughter and the scent of her favorite pasta, was now just a silent, empty room. I tried to push myself forward, but it felt like moving through quicksand. I'd go to work, go through the motions, but the loneliness was relentless, like a dull ache that I couldn't shake. Friends tried to distract me with weekend outings and late-night beers, but I'd come home to that same hollow feeling. I spent hours scrolling through social media, wondering if she was as lost as I was or if she'd already moved on. One night, I finally broke down. I'd found an old photo of us, one where we were laughing on the beach, sand in our hair, sunburned but happy. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I cried like I hadn't in years, letting all the pain, the loss, the frustration pour out. I think I'd been holding it back, too scared to face it all head on. After that night, I knew I had to start rebuilding piece by piece. I signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always wanted to try, but never had. I went back to old hobbies, picking up my guitar for the first time in ages. I took weekend trips by myself, rediscovering the parts of me I'd let fade. It was painful, and sometimes it still is, but I'm starting to feel like myself again, like I'm coming up for air after being underwater for too long. There are days when I still miss her, still wonder if we could have made it work. I think of her when I hear her favorite songs or pass by places we used to go. And while it's hard, I've realized that sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together. Sometimes love just changes. So for anyone who's been through something like this, how did you let go? How did you find yourself again? Because I'm trying, and I think I'm getting there, but some days it feels like there's still a long way to go.